In this video, I'm going to show you a breakdown of a few desert scenes I created, primarily to get back into environment design and to focus on a new feature in UE4, sky atmosphere. The idea behind this project was to create something new that I haven't done before, yet keep it simple enough where I didn't have to create custom content, I didn't have to paint foliage, or create texture layers and paint textures on the terrain, or to optimize. I primarily wanted to create something very quick, very minimalistic, focused on the sky atmosphere feature in a large open landscape. The simplicity of this project allowed me to get it done in a couple of days and share the process with you. And I've noticed one major roadblock that holds many people back, including me, is the scope of their ideas. Many projects require weeks if not months to complete, and that alone often stops people from ever even creating the environment. And by picking a simpler idea, focusing on something minimalistic, and getting it done in a few days can help you build confidence in order to begin to explore some of the bigger projects and get them off the ground. So in this video, in this tutorial, I will share the breakdown of how I created the desert scene, the sand dunes, and the pyramids environment, very quickly utilizing the tools and assets that are available in UE4, and I got it done in just a couple of days. And the best part of this breakdown is it can be easily duplicated for similar projects and applied into your own work. Let's begin. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the sky atmosphere. What is it? Sky atmosphere is a new feature that was introduced in 4.25, and it is a physically based sky and atmosphere rendering technique. It is flexible enough to create an Earth-like atmosphere, and you've probably seen some work being done, and includes time of day feature. You can have sunrise and sunset that is more realistic, Earth-like, or you can create more alien-based worlds. So there are two components to sky atmosphere. The time of day, the sunrise to sunset feature, which allows you to create very realistic lighting situation of our planet, our Earth. The second part is the aerial perspective with space. And this is where you can go outside into space, into more of a planetary view of the galaxy, of the universe. And for this project, I only wanted to focus on the time of day, sunrise to sunset, more realistic and down on Earth environment. But you could probably take the breakdown that I'm about to show you and apply it to more broader spectrum and do the planetary aerial views of the galaxy, of the universe. So the sky atmosphere is a dynamic actor, and it requires a directional light to be set to movable. This means that I did not have to worry about baking lights or dealing with light maps, and everything that I would see in the viewport would represent the actual lighting of the scene. So that was a big plus, and it sped up the project. I started with a time of day template that's available in UE4. If you go to File, New, you can choose the time of day template. And this template gives you a starting point to create in. It contains a directional light, a skylight, a sky dome mesh, and the sky atmosphere. And everything is set up to work together. So this template provides you with all the essential actors to start your environment. And that's what I used. Now, the auto exposure in time of day template has to update itself to the scene. And this is why you will see the fade in effect in the viewport and when you spawn into the game. And it's not a big deal because it does adjust itself correctly after a few seconds. But I don't like to have to wait, and I want to turn this fade in off. And for this you need the post-process volume, so you can control the auto exposure, the eye adaptation. So here's what I did. Insert post-process volume. With it selected in the details panel, set it to unbound. Then set auto exposure minimum and maximum brightness values both to 1. Then under exposure compensation, you have two options. You can set it to 0 or you can keep it at 1. The number you choose here will depend on the directional light intensity that you set. So for me, I set it to 0, and then I have to select the directional light and set its intensity to 9. And my scene will look almost identical to the default time of day template minus the fade in effect. Now, if you want to keep exposure compensation at 1, the default, then you need to set directional light intensity to 5. And this will do the same thing. So it depends if you want to keep the exposure compensation at 0 or at 1. And then you adjust the directional light intensity accordingly. Now there's going to be incorrect reflection showing up in the viewport. So all you need to do is build reflection capture. And this will fix the scene. So this was more of an annoying issue of having to constantly spawn into the map to test and have that fade in effect take over. And I just don't like that. And this is how you My main thing for this project is I didn't want to have to sculpt the terrain by hand. I wanted to automate the process. And although I wouldn't need to do much for the desert dunes type of terrain, other than add some noise, I still didn't want to have to do that manually. So to get the height map, I used Terrain Party. And I found a location somewhere in Colorado that had a sand dune appearance. And I came to this location completely by accident. And once I saw it, I knew exactly that this would create a desert-like appearance. If you want to learn how to use Terrain Party for UE4, I do have a tutorial that you can take a look at, and I will link it in the blog post and under the description in the video. So I got the height map, but it included some other parts of the terrain that I did not want to use. And I also wanted to have a much larger terrain size than what Terrain Party gives you. By default, Terrain Party always generates the same size height map, 1081 by 1081. But I wanted something bigger, so I needed to do some Photoshop work. So what I did is I created a new document, made sure I had it set to 16-bit grayscale, and I made the size 2017 by 2017 to make it 2 square kilometers. And if you're wondering why I used 2017, this is from the Epic's recommended landscape chart for terrain sizes. And I will link a blog post again for this in the description of the video or in the blog post. So then I brought over the terrain height map from Terrain Party and I just cloned that one section, the sand dunes all over. I duplicated parts of it, cloned the other, and I made sure that this is all you see on a 2017 by 2017 image. Now it looks very messy and you can see the repetition on the height map, but that doesn't really matter because you're going to be only seeing the terrain from player's point of view and not high up above. So the repetition will not be noticeable. And I was okay with this. I then saved this new height map as a 16-bit PNG file and imported it into UE4. And this gave me 2 square kilometer large terrain that I used for the project. Now when you bring in the height map into UE4, the scale of it is usually too intense. So I scaled the terrain, the landscape down on Z to 20. And this made the height map, the terrain, less intense and more workable. Now let's talk about the assets I used. The terrain material was from Quixel Bridge and it's the bright desert sand surface. I used the material instance that Megascans creates automatically when you import from Bridge. So I didn't create a landscape material. I didn't even go inside the material editor. I just took the material instance that Megascans gave me and I applied it straight onto the landscape. And this was just a single texture material, and through the material instance I had a few adjustments that I could make, such as intensity of the normal map, the scale, the repetition of the texture. So I adjusted the material instance and that was it. The pyramid meshes came from Epic's vehicle demo. This vehicle demo is an old one. It came out in the very beginning of Unreal Engine. But this demo contains a lot of great and rarely used desert theme assets and includes the pyramids that I used. So what I did is I duplicated a few assets folders from the vehicle demo project and I copied them over directly into my own project. And then opened up my own project and I just used those pyramids. There's only one pyramid, but I duplicated 2 more times and set it far away in the distance and that's what I wanted to use. So you can see the assets I used were very minimal, and it just gave me something to work with. One was included for a focal point, the pyramids, and the other one that I needed is for terrain texture. You can find the vehicle game under the Learn tab and right over here. For scale, I always include a mannequin in all of the projects I work on and in every scene. This helps me judge the correct size of the material that I use for the terrain and the overall dimensions of the environment. And I always insert one into the scene, place it on the ground, and go from there. Otherwise, it's very difficult to tell the size of the environment as well as how big to scale the ground texture. Within the blog post, I will include a video on how to add this UE4 mannequin into your project, and I will also link it in the description of the video. So up to this point, I have the time of day template. I have post-process volume to control auto exposure. I brought in the terrain height map, created the terrain, inserted UE4 mannequin for scale, and applied the Megascans material instance onto the terrain and adjusted some of its properties. And for the second scene, I did the same thing, but I've also included the pyramids. And now my next step is to begin adjusting sky atmosphere settings and work with the lighting. And I begin with the lighting first. Here's the dune scene, very basic, and using default lighting. I then found a composition, a point of view where I would want to take all the screenshots from. And it was going to be somewhere around right here, looking all the way down the terrain. And from this point, I began to adjust the directional light. A shortcut to use to change the directional light is hold down Ctrl and L and move the mouse. You will move the sun, the position of the directional light, and change the lighting. Since the directional light is tied to the sky atmosphere and they work together, the sky atmosphere will also update. Now the sky atmosphere right now has default settings, but it will still react and affect your scene based on the direction of the sun. And this was a quick way to find where I want the sun position, the sun lighting come from for the scene. Then I began to adjust the directional light intensity. Based on the angle, I went with 7. And just to note what I talked about earlier, for this scene, I actually had exposure compensation on the post-process volume set to default 1. So the lighting intensity is gonna be affected by the exposure compensation. And then instead of adjusting the light color, I went with temperature. So I enabled use temperature and set the temperature for this scene to 5000. And if you've never used temperature before, I highly recommend it. It will give you more predictable and realistic lighting. And there is a chart you can find online for color temperature. And then I went ahead and started to adjust the skylight properties, primarily the intensity. I changed the intensity for the scene to 2, and I periodically build reflection capture just to make sure that the viewport has updated itself correctly. And there's one more thing on the skylight that I enabled. Inside the template, the skylight lower hemisphere is solid color is disabled. With it enabled, it gives you more accurate lighting representation from the sky, especially for scenes where the ground blocks the sky. So I've tested both methods, with and without, and I found that having it enabled for this particular scene and the pyramids gave me more accurate skylight results. And this was the starting point for the desert dunes. For the pyramids, I did exactly the same thing. By default, you can see lighting is very flat and not very interesting. So I started with the directional light position, found the angle of the sun that created more interesting shadows and just far more pleasing composition of lighting and shadow. Then I adjusted the intensity of the directional light, enabled use temperature, gave a temperature of 7000, then adjusted the skylight, gave intensity to 2.5, and again for this light, for the skylight, I went ahead and enabled lower hemisphere is solid color. I would recommend that you try both and see which one works best for your scene. And this was the starting point for the pyramids. And also, just to kind of drill this more, I found the point of view, the perspective from which I would want to take screenshots from. And that's when I began to adjust the lighting and find the direction of the sun based on that composition, based on that point of view. And that helps a lot to determine what kind of lighting you want and what kind of direction of the sun as far as composition goes that you are looking for. And at this point, this is where I began to adjust sky atmosphere settings. Now, there's a lot of sky atmosphere settings to play with. And as you adjust the directional light position, the sky atmosphere will also update to simulate how particles would react to that time of day. So I found that there has to be a constant tweaking and adjusting between the directional light intensity, the temperature, the skylight intensity, and the sky atmosphere. And if I changed one, then I had to go back and tweak and update the others. And if you have exponential height fog, you'd also have to change the fog color to match the color of the environment from the sky atmosphere. And I'll go over some of the exponential height fog properties in just a bit. So that was the key to working with sky atmosphere that I found. You constantly have to tweak the directional light, the skylight, and the sky atmosphere, as well as the exponential height fog if you have one, so they match to what you want depending on the sun position in the sky. Now, the two fundamental categories in sky atmosphere settings are MI and Rayleigh scattering. And these two settings control how particles and molecules are absorbed by the atmosphere. So adjusting the settings for these two scattering methods changes how these particles are absorbed by the sky atmosphere. What helped me understand the difference between the two is MI scattering is how light interacts with larger particles in the atmosphere, such as dust, pollen, air pollution, and it usually absorbs light, causing haziness or clarity. So increasing or decreasing MI density causes more or less clarity in the sky. So if you wanted hazy overcast day, you would adjust MI scattering. Now, Rayleigh scattering is how light interacts with smaller particles, air molecules, and it's highly dependent on the light situation. So these are the two scattering methods I began to tweak. I either adjusted MI scattering first or Rayleigh scattering first, and just see what it gave me. And a lot of the settings I changed were on the fly. I just started to experiment with one of the methods first and pushing it to extreme amounts to see what it does, then putting it back down to a more reasonable amount. And if I ever need to reset to default, you can just reset all the settings back and start all over. And even though it was a lot of fun to experiment and push these settings to create these impressive results, something that would be very difficult to do using the previous atmosphere actor, I did find sky atmosphere not to be very artist friendly. These settings don't really make a lot of sense unless you've studied and know these scattering methods. And the problem is, if I had to replicate the same situation, the same lighting and sky atmosphere settings, I wouldn't be able to, because I got here just by experimenting and pushing each option and getting a lot of these results purely by accident. I would have to come up with a better system, a better method that gives me more predictable results, so I know exactly what they do and what I need to do. The atmosphere absorption I changed the least for this project. This allows you to set what color and the amount of that color gets absorbed in the atmosphere. And when it's absorbed, it's removed. So you can think of this: if you want one color to be absorbed or removed from the environment, then the opposite color on the color wheel will appear. And you can increase the absorption scale and then set the color to see what effect it has on the scene. But I didn't get a lot of good predictable results with this, so I didn't change it as much. The art direction category allows you to change the sky luminance factor. This helps to set a different sky color that isn't based on the real world particle absorption. So this was more of a artistic input that you can create by adding a different sky color into the environment. So I did change a little bit of this, and it gave me pretty good results. Exponential height fog adds a fog effect into your environment. Now, sky atmosphere is said to be capable of simulating fog, so exponential height fog is actually not necessary. But I found exponential height fog easier to work with for this project. and I had a hard time trying to get the same fog effect with sky atmosphere alone. So I ended up using exponential height fog. Also, exponential height fog helped me fill the bottom part of the screen world with a solid color, something sky atmosphere cannot do. And the color below right now that you see in the time of day template is done by the sky dome mesh, included in the time of day template. It also renders the moving clouds across the sky, but sky atmosphere by itself will display black below the horizon line. And exponential height fog can help you fill that black void with fog. If you are going to use exponential height fog with sky atmosphere, there's one important setting you need to enable in project settings. So you would need to go to Edit, Project Settings. Under Engine, Rendering, you have to enable Support Sky Atmosphere Effect and Height Fog. Then in the sky atmosphere properties, you would use height fog contribution to scale its effect. For the exponential height fog properties, I updated it for various lighting setups, and the properties that I focused on were fog density, fog height falloff, fog in scattering color. This is when you're looking away from the light source, the sun. Fog max opacity, directional in-scattering color. This is when you are looking at the light source, the sun. Directional in-scattering exponent. And I enabled volumetric fog. Now, the important part of working with exponential height fog with various lighting setups is you have to update the exponential height fog color, the density, and all the settings that I just mentioned to match the directional light and the sky atmosphere settings. Otherwise, when you change to a new lighting setup and you adjust and change sky atmosphere settings, the fog does not automatically adjust itself to what you changed. So then you would have to go to exponential height fog and tweak the settings to match to your scene. So I had to do this for all the experiments and all the screenshots that you saw that I took. I also used Cine Camera Actor instead of the perspective viewport for screenshots. This camera actor can be animated using Blueprint, but in my case I only use it for static compositional shots. Now, Cine Camera Actor uses real-world lens settings that are not available in the regular views. So you have things like focal length, f-stop, ability to choose film back, so it gives you more control over what you see. A helpful tip to set up the camera and control the point of view: select the camera, and then if you press Ctrl-Shift-P, you'll be able to pilot the camera and view it from its perspective. And then you can use the regular movement keys to position the point of view of the camera better for taking screenshots or for setting up your video shots. And you can do this not only to cameras, but to spotlights and even directional lights. And then once you're done, make sure you eject to leave the camera where you like it and you don't move it around anymore. The post-process is the last part of any environment creation. And post-process should always be done at the very end after you've done lighting. And post-process allows you to adjust colors, saturation, contrast, shadows, midtones, highlights on the entire scene. For example, for this scene, if I disable it and enable it, you see the before and after. I just adjusted a few properties: chromatic aberration, and then primarily the global settings for saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, and offset. And for the pyramid scene, the effects of post-process were more intense, more pronounced. So here's what I had before, just with lighting and sky atmosphere. And then I adjusted more intense chromatic aberration, vignette, and the primary color change was done global under saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, and offset. So post-process volume is what you use to control and define how you want your final environment to look. So this is pretty much it I focused only on a few things that I described in this video, and I hope you enjoyed the breakdown of somewhat of a simple scene and very minimal amount of steps and assets that I used to create it. Thanks for watching the video, and if you want to learn more about how to start using UE4 from the very beginning, or how to begin using UE4 terrain system to create landscapes, and a few other courses that are focused primarily on using UE4 and creating environments, take a look at some of the courses that I have created over the last few months and over the last few years, and they will get you started for creating environments using UE4. You can learn more at worldofleveldesign.com/store. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.